Maxed Out Man, helping you become the man you were made to be.
Hey guys, this is Kevin Davis from Maxed Out Man Podcast. This is episode number 23. We are here with Christopher Veal, or is it Veal?
Veal, like veal parmesan.
Yeah, Christopher Veal. And he is a vulnerability Vanguard global influencer, international speaker, author of The Whole Man, Evolving Masculinity, and podcast host from The Vulnerable Man. Honestly, I feel like that, you're overqualified to be here, but I really appreciate and I'm honored that you would take the time to come on board and have a great talk about masculinity and probably connection and some of the things that you teach around the world. So welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here, Kevin. Thank you for having me on the show. And I'm excited for the conversation that we get into today.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, this is pretty open format. So why don't you give me a little bit about your background and kind of what you do? And, you could drive wherever we want to end up. I know you've got a lot to share with these guys and, I think it'll be awesome.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, you mentioned most of the highlights in the introduction you read about me. So my primary work, I do executive coaching and I do speaking engagements in organizations and events. I do a lot of talk around inclusive leadership, around helping leaders bring more vulnerability so that they can have greater impact and influence with the people that they lead. As you mentioned, the book, The Whole Man, Evolving Masculinity, I published that last year. And that was a book that I say took me 6 months and 50 years to write. And I'm also the father of a teenage daughter, which is probably one of my most important jobs. She will be entering high school this fall. So that is a new adventure for us that we are navigating our way through as well.
Yeah, you're right. You're right in the thick of it. I remember when
two were out of the house already, right?
Yeah, they're 25 in a couple of weeks, and I remember when they were 14, their heads started spinning around doing that Linda Blair thing. And I mean, they're awesome kids, but that was an interesting time.
Yeah. Well, knock on wood, the teenage years have been good so far. I hope they continue, but
Me too.
I'm doing my best.
God bless you, brother. That's what we'll speak over that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing I'd mention is, so I've been doing leadership development in some form or shape for the last 25 years. I spent 9 years as an officer in the Marine Corps in the infantry, including a combat tour in Iraq. Spent 6.5 years in construction doing project management, and then about a decade in organizations doing learning and development and organizational development work. And one of the things that I've realized throughout it all is there's certain ways that we as men are expected to show up in different situations. And that's what got me on my own path to this curiosity that I have and brought me to where I am today.
I mean, dude, if you don't get much more traditionally masculine than construction and Marine Corps and combat veteran. And, it's like, that's,
yeah.
So for you to so what was the journey in not stepping away, but integrating what would be more modern, enlightened, we can call it, masculinity,
sure,
into that?
There were a couple things that happened in short order. One of them was my daughter was born, I became a father. And so that really started me questioning how I was showing up. So when I was in the Marine Corps and when I was in construction, I was successful in those roles, but I also felt like I could only bring a portion of myself because there was a way you were expected to show up, as you talked about. And when my daughter was born, I was working in the construction job, and it was interesting, some of the comments, because I live in California. And when my wife, my now ex-wife, was pregnant, I had put in to take paternity leave. And I got a lot of pushback from some of the guys, especially the older guys at my work. I heard comments like, why are you taking maternity leave? They didn't even know what paternity leave was. Or I'd hear comments like, oh, raising kids is women's work. And that really just reinforced my resolve to be present for my daughter, because my parents divorced when I was 4 years old. And so I knew what it was like not to have my father as part of my life growing up. And I knew that when my child was born, I was not going to allow that to happen. And so I really wanted to be present. And those comments really just steeled my reserve to say, no, I will be. So that happened, and it really had me look at how did I want to show up and what's the example I wanted to set as a man. But then I also did a leadership program, a year-long leadership program in 2015. And coming out of it, you have what's called a leader quest. Mm-hmm. And for me, what it was is I wanted to explore the conversation around men and vulnerability, because I had seen Brene Brown's talk, The Power of Vulnerability, and her second one, Listening to Shame, shortly after. And I realized there were parts of me that I didn't let out in certain spaces, or I wouldn't, allow to show up in some ways. And so it got me really curious about and exploring. And I started having conversations with men one-on-one about what got in the way for them being vulnerable, especially with other men, because a lot of men are willing to be vulnerable with their partners, particularly when they're female partners, but don't usually with the guys. Like, you're kind of that tough love kind of thing, but you won't really share how you're feeling or if you're struggling. And as I started talking with men, I realized a lot of the guys that I was talking to wanted to have more opportunity to be vulnerable, but they didn't feel safe doing it. And so that really got me looking at, how does society hold the way we view men? And that's really what started this whole snowball for me.
Yeah, it's a crazy, it's crazy being a man. I talked to a woman yesterday that was like, I don't envy it, because it's a dichotomy in terms of how we normally think of it. Like, I would hate to be a woman in today's society. And I think more people, I've heard that phrase. I don't know how you guys do it. Like, it's a hard place. It's a hard place to be. I love that you took that step for your daughter. I actually really struggled. I was kind of a workaholic when my first one was born, and I was traveling all over the United States. I kind of missed the first 6 months of my daughter's life as a result of it. And then completely, at the bequest and urging of my wife, which bequest means, hey, do you want to remain married and have a family? That was her request, Yeah. I actually turned my entire life around. I went to my boss, said, look, I can't travel anymore. I need to do this. And lo and behold, I got a huge raise, didn't have to travel anymore, didn't come in early, didn't stay late. And so, in my mind, it's kind of God ordained and God helping that situation. But it was also a matter of my boss, really respecting and wanting me to take that step. And I think dads forget how important we are, especially to daughters, sons for sure. But you're defining what a male what a guy is supposed to look like, right?
Right. Well, as my father-in-law said to me when my daughter was born, you're the first man she'll ever love. And that really hit home when he said that, because that carries a lot of responsibility. What I really want to acknowledge is your boss, because most men don't feel safe saying they want to take more time to be a parent, because a lot of organizations still have that stereotypical mindset of, if you're not here and putting work first, you really don't care. And so as a result, that's one of the things that gets in the way of men taking time to be caregivers and has them less willing to, which creates more friction and tension in the home as well.
Yeah. I think that I had some obviously motivation, and so a little bit of leverage, because at that point it was kind of this was back in the .com days. So it was a startup, and I was able to find somebody I was a corporate trainer. So I did 2 to 3 cities a week. I was responsible for everything.
A lot of road time. Yes.
Yeah. But at that point we had developed the company enough to be able to take that and to say, I'm going to hand this off. And then I actually got a raise, and I ended up with about 300 global employees that worked under me. I worked from home more often and all that. And so all that to say, there are ways to solve that problem, and there are ways to approach that problem, and realize that just because you think it's not possible, and obviously in some jobs, if you're a particular kind of worker, you're going to have a really hard time having that discussion.
Right.
But
I don't want my waiter at the restaurant working remotely. Like, I prefer they're there bringing my food out. But you're right.
Well, they got robots at McDonald's now. So,
do you know what? I better be careful what I say. Maybe 5 years from now, I will change my mind about it.
Yeah. The little Rosie, the robot from the Jetsons doing that. Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing about the pandemic, is it's really shown us that a lot of these organizations who feel like we have to have a brick and mortar place and have to have employees at their desks every day to be productive, we've seen that doesn't work. Or not that doesn't work, but it doesn't have to be the way that we work. And there's some organizations that have made the change now, and they're not going back. They're keeping their people entirely remote, which gives people more flexibility too. So I think the thing I'm really celebrating about that is it's giving us different ways of approaching things, and you get to look at what's needed for the business and what's also going to serve our people. Because that's a thing a lot of businesses have learned too, is if they're being inflexible, people will leave. And they'll leave for less money if it gives them greater flexibility. So, good businesses are willing to flex if they need to.
Well, and I think that probably it's this productivity balance, right? Like that big joke was the girl that was posted on TikTok, her typical day at Twitter. Okay. And literally the girl worked like 25 minutes of an 8-hour day, because she was getting wine and she was going to the coffee bar, and like, You have to look it up. It's out there on YouTube. It was absolutely, she got fired, obviously. Right. And he fired, that's one of the reasons when Elon took over Twitter, he fired so many people because that was the culture of doing nothing.
Okay.
But it was like, just a cushy job and all that. But I think the balance now is to try to figure out, I've worked from home for over 25 years.
Right.
I have my own office here. I don't go to an office. There are days when I live in rural Montana. So there are weeks where I don't leave the house at all.
You might not be able to in sometimes in the winter, right?
There are definitely times when you don't want to go out in 40 below zero. But like, I think the challenge and to your kind of quest and what you're doing is how do we get connected and stay connected?
Absolutely.
I do that a lot through not only the podcast, but because I have global worldwide friendships and don't have a lot of local friends. These are my friendships, and this is how I interact with my friends.
Absolutely. I think that we are hardwired for connection. That's just how we are. I mean, you think back to look at how our ancestors grew up and they would gather in groups as a way of surviving. And even though our society has changed and we're not in that hunter-gatherer type of environment, we still have that craving for connection, and it shows up differently. But I'll tell you, technology is a blessing and a curse. Like I love it. Because I can interact with you. I'm in Southern California and we can have this conversation. It's also, we've got to have a balance because I also, like my daughter, faces in the phone a lot, right? Yeah. And all her friends are, and I don't fault them because that's what they're growing up with. But how do you know where the balance is so that you can have connection that's real and not just that through a screen and impersonal sometimes, which I think happens.
And cultivated. That's that's the big thing is you can't have vulnerability in a cultivated environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's funny that you talk about this connection for men because it's something that I grew up with a totally wild childhood. And I think I listened to your TED Talk this morning talking about how the way I describe it is being a chameleon. Mm-hmm. Like I was in 9 different schools for the first 8 years of my of elementary through junior high. But I got to be really good, and I still have that skill of finding a connection with everybody I meet in some way. Because, like you said, you got the band geeks and the jocks and all of those things, which I, like you said in your TED Talk, I'm not even sure those exist still in high school, but
they may not be, right? Or they've got different terms now that they use, right?
Yeah, but it's that finding that connection is so important.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that's key to it is being able to be in conversation and be curious with people. So often, as my mother would say, she used to tell people like, stop broadcasting, start tuning in.
Yeah. And
that's really something I've taken to heart because a number of people that I run into on a daily basis are so busy about sharing what they want to talk about that even when they're listening, they're just waiting for their turn to talk. But when you find people that are really willing to be in conversation, that just changes the game for everything.
Yeah. I have a recommendation to all men is start a podcast like this. That would be
what's a great way to have some great conversations.
It is. And honestly, like I'm a guy that just talks a lot. And I have a low, deep, loud voice. Like that's just so it tends to overpower people. And I have kind of that go-getter mentality and vibe or whatever you want to call it. So I have to doing this has really helped me. And even my wife is like,
right.
She's like, man, you are definitely practicing at becoming a better listener.
Wow.
And so, and that's part of this. Cause like, I want to talk and then I want to have you talk for 10 minutes. Like that's because I want to learn.
I can relate. I have a podcast. I do the same thing. Right.
Yeah. And so I think it makes us better listeners. And the problem with now is like we both can't listen at the same time. Somebody has to do
somebody else
has to do the talking.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that's really helped me is something that I learned when I was trained to be a coach, because I like to say I'm a recovering world-class problem solver. Part of that was just reinforced by my time in the military. But if somebody comes to me with something, my mind is automatically racing, connecting the dots and going, oh, I see what's a possible solution. Mm-hmm. And what really helped me is to let go of whatever that is, but more importantly, not think about something to say until they just finish talking, so that it really has me be conscious to what they're saying and following to the end of that last sentence, and then go, so what am I curious about from what they just said? And that's been helpful. I don't always succeed, but more often than not, it helps me out.
Yeah, I'm that way too. I never did military, but I almost pursued it. It just didn't work out for me. But I have a very military kind of. I would have loved to do special ops or something like that. But I always want to solve the problem. When I used to early in my career, I managed multi-million-dollar health clubs.
Okay.
I can tell you if an exit sign has one bulb out. I don't know if you know this, but all exit signs have two bulbs in them, or at least they used to. This was back in the incandescent light days. But you can tell if one's out. So that's my brain. I can see that from across the mall. So that's a metaphor for how I see life in general. And one of my biggest challenges, I don't know if you experience this, but people, when you think that way, people are an obstacle to me.
Sometimes
and I really struggle, and I work really hard at not having that be the case. But I think that it's so many times it's like, you're in my way, or you're being too slow, or, whatever it is.
Yeah. We also have to remember, for me, is I also have to remember that not everybody processes things at the same speed that I do, which isn't necessarily a detriment, because there's times where, because I do that so quickly, I miss things. Where the people that slow down a little will get more information. So it's this balance in figuring out what's needed in this moment and how do I need to show up, and also leave space for others too, because that's one of the things I've really loved is everyone operates at different ways, and we're all needed, and we all have unique approaches. So I know my way isn't always the best way, even though sometimes in my head I'm like, well, of course this is the best answer. And I've learned that, yes, that's not always the case.
Yeah. And even if it is the quote unquote best answer for a given situation, that doesn't mean that's the best, doesn't mean it's the only or the right answer. I'm embarrassed to say, when my girls were younger, one of my youngest, she tells very, very long stories, like to get to anything. And I'm embarrassed to say that I was like, come on, I need you to, let's at some point get to the point. I had to practice not being overly impatient, but I'm not a patient man. So that I'm embarrassed to say that I've worked on that over the years. But even now it's like, okay, well, she's called. We're going to take some time and really, tune everything else out.
Yeah. Well, and again, so the communication is such a key thing, because I'm more of a bullet point, high level, big picture kind of thinker and operator. And some people like a lot more detail. And for me, if somebody sends me an email with like a spreadsheet with lots of information, my eyes roll back in my head and I hear the Charlie Brown wah, 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 wah voice, and I check out. And so what I have to realize is, when I interact with people that like more information, I've got to give them more information, which is counter to my natural instincts. And I have to take more of that breath, as you said, to be willing to hear them so that they feel met as well. Because ultimately, I have control over how much space I leave for them. And again, it's not necessarily about me. It's how do we effectively communicate?
And as far as being effective in that way, how are you, obviously listening and slowing down and absorbing more of their information, how are you adjusting your approach to giving out information to meet kind of what they need in order to have you communicate effectively with them?
Yeah. One of the best tips that I learned. So my ex-wife and I, we struggled from time to time, and sometimes she would come to me and be looking for advice, and sometimes just needing to vent. And I wasn't sure how to respond. And I would get lost. There were times where I would, trip on my own feet and start giving advice when that wasn't what she wanted. And I finally, somebody said to me, well, why don't you just check and ask? And I was like, oh, that's an obvious answer. And so I would say, when she would come, I would say, let me just check. Do you need problem solver, Christopher, or do you need listener, Christopher? And she might go, all right, I need problem solver, or I need listener. Or she might say, I don't know. And I said, cool, but that helps me. And so that way, it would allow me to really show up in a way that served what they needed. And so the lesson that I took away from it is, if I'm not sure, I'm going to err on the side of listening until they ask for help. Because what I know is, sometimes when I share things with friends, I don't instantly want them to solve it for me. I'm a pretty capable guy. I can figure it out. But sometimes I just need to share what's going on so that it allows me the space to think about it. And so I default to more listening than problem solving, unless they specifically say, hey, Christopher, put on your problem solving hat. And then I'm like, not a problem. I can do that.
Yeah, it's literally, I just turn it around.
Yep, got it. Yep.
It was already there. Yeah, it's I talk a lot about, there's a guy named Dr. Gary Chapman that has and even everybody's probably heard of the 5 love languages.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so it's similar in that it's you can use that throughout your life, and even if it's not those specific 5 things, if you are able to try to identify those, how best to have people feel listened to and cared for and loved and all of those. Those are, especially in a marriage, because mine and my wife's are, drastically different, which is great. We've been married for 28 years, so evidently we're still figuring it out. But my problem solving with her has been something throughout our marriage to where, like, I have not allowed her to solve her own problems. And so about in 2016, our kids had pretty much left the house at that point. She reinvented herself from a stay-at-home mom into rally racer, welder, car builder.
Wow.
All of these things. But she had to learn how to do all those things because she had no background in whatsoever. So I had to be really deliberate about, not
step in and offer. And
because we built we basically rebuilt her Jeep for the first off-road rally completely. Like, it's only got a few parts left that we started with. And so I had to be able to step away and say, look, if this is something you can do on your own, let me show you how to do it. And this is how it goes. And that's really helped her.
Yeah. And how has that changed your relationship? You being able to step back a little and let her find her way?
Oh, it's made a huge difference. She's always had, self-confidence issues, but this is over the last, 7 years or so. It's really, she's grown tremendously in that. And we've been able to then continue that. We're building a 3,400 square foot shop with 16-foot walls.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah. And it's just the two of us.
Yeah. Well, even as you talk about her too in that way, like, I see the pride in how she stepped into it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a compliment to the both of you that you were able to find your way and allow that to happen too.
Yeah. And it's, to your point, it's, a lot of times I have to say, is this something you want me, because I tend to assume she needs my help on certain things.
Right.
Which is sometimes the case, not always, if it's a pickle jar, I know my role there. I got to open that thing.
Right.
But, there are times. So now we just had this discussion about 2 weeks ago. Can you ask me if I need help before you give that help? Yeah. But a perfect example of how we do things now is, so the walls are like 75 feet long on this building. And I had built several walls already, and we'd done it together. And I was like, well, I think you need to build this 65-foot wall by yourself. And so I showed her the basic framing, handed her a nail gun, and said, here, don't shoot yourself in the leg. Mm-hmm. And she built the whole, these are huge walls. She built the whole 65-foot section in smaller sections, but she built it by herself, which is it's pretty awesome.
There's something pretty amazing when we hold that someone's capable of doing something. It's amazing how they actually live up to our expectations, right? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell somebody they're not good at doing something, eventually they're going to believe they're not, even if they have the ability. And so I love the idea of, like, I trust that you can do it. She may have thought, I'm not sure, but knowing that you believe she could probably gave some impetus for her to be able to do it. So awesome.
And she made some mistakes, and she was really pissed at herself that she did it. Yeah. I'm like, what? I'm like, yeah, I expect you to build this perfectly because you've done it so much. I'm like, here's how you fix. I'm like, and so that I would say, here's what I see. Here's the things that I think that she already knew the mistakes that she had made. And I said, well, go fix them. I'm not going to fix that for you. Here's some strategies to fix it. But I think, to your point about raising daughters, it's something that her dad spent her whole life telling her, that you're a girl, you're overly emotional. Every problem you have is because of estrogen. And, the fact that literally it's just, you're a girl. So she had this impression of not being able to do pretty much anything, especially as a woman. And I've talked about this multiple times on the podcast, but she got involved in these all-female vehicle builds. Mm-hmm. For SEMA, and SEMA is the biggest trade show in the world.
Yeah.
But it's 60 to 80 tradeswomen. They're high-end welders, automotive builders, technicians, and all this stuff. So she got to be around all these women to show her that, I can actually do this. Right.
Absolutely. Right. Well, and that comes to, if they don't see the examples, they don't know that it's a possibility. Right. And that's part of, so a big thing that I talk about is this idea of healthy versus unhealthy masculinity. And the reason I chose evolving masculinity as part of the title of my book is, it's not about throwing away what it means to be a man, because there are some good elements, but there's also some things that have created problems in our world. So how do we expand it and show more examples of more range? So I don't have to be an alpha male to be a man. That can be part of it. But it's a big thing I stand for is instead of either or thinking, we shift to both and. So, and actually I was listening to Ed, and you have a conversation as well right before we got on, and he was talking about similar things. I love Ed. I've talked to him in the past, but it's men can be the breadwinner and a provider or a caregiver, not either or. I can be independent and strong and still sometimes need to ask for help. And so that's how we need to shift things. And similar for my daughter, I have always said, I'm going to give her opportunities to do lots of things she wants. We get on my motorcycle all the time. When she's ready, I'm going to teach her how to ride a motorcycle and do all those other things she wants to. I don't want her to think about there's boy things and girl things, because at this point we're in a world where we're beyond binary, right?
Yeah.
And I'm still trying to unprogram that, because I turned 52 last month, and I've got more than 4 decades of programming saying genders are, boys and girls. Well, that's not our world anymore. So how do I unlearn that? Because that's what she's already growing up in.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about the challenge of being able, because I think now we're almost moving men towards that other end of that continuity, that continuum. If you look at kind of younger boys, like they're almost taught that any of those masculinity based traits are a bad thing, versus we want to maintain some of those where they're appropriate, but then also expand that like you're doing.
Yeah. I think what it is it's not, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because again, there are some good things, but part of the problem is we've associated some characteristics with being a man, which actually isn't true. Like, for example, independence and being strong. I was raised by a single mother. That's what I saw every day in her. So I don't necessarily see that as something that's a male trait, but that's how they often get portrayed in the media. And I think that's a big part of how we shape and influence how we're looking at things. So we also need to look at what are the examples that people are seeing as they're growing up. I also think about the examples we had growing up. So a lot of the men that I talk to, when they talk about their fathers, vulnerability wasn't a word that ever would have come up. I've talked to so many guys that say, I don't know that I've ever seen my dad cry. And that's not a fault of those men, because they were operating off the examples that they had. What I'm an advocate for is, how do we expand the possibility? So it's not to take away everything that's here, but how do we keep the parts? In nature, when things evolve, they keep what's needed, and then they adapt new traits or characteristics to survive in this new environment. That's part of what we need to do here. Keep what works, and the things that aren't, let them go and find new ways to integrate so that we can be a better resource and survivor in the future.
Yeah,
I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, I think you did. I think the challenges that we face now, like if TV and media and all that, the men are always dumb and dopey, and there's no, like, what they've done is they've decided at some point that a man has to have, if they're a guy, if they're always dumb. Right. They don't know how to make good decisions, or they're too alpha, which is, those traits exist. But I think the challenge now is that it's how we kind of expand that so that women become more of become better women, and men become better men by incorporating things of both of what really is kind of our natural makeup, because the genders are different in terms of, like, because of hormones and upbringing and all of these things. With my girls, for example, so I've made it a point, I probably open my wife's car door 98% of the time. And I taught my girls the same thing. But my youngest is a 23-year-old paramedic in Atlanta who, when she gets on the scene, she's in charge of about 25 alpha males, first responders, because she's in charge of the scene.
Absolutely.
My other daughter's very strong, and so, but they understand that a man can show respect. To have a woman tell me that I'm denigrating her by opening a door for her, I want to just shut the door in her face, because it's like, what? That's not the case. Like, I'm just trying to be respectful. I open it for other guys too.
Right. I think part of what you're pointing to is, we're trying to figure out how to be in this current world, because you're right. That's how I was brought up. You open the door for someone. And I remember once when I was in college, I think I was on a first date with a woman, and I went to open the door for her, and she goes, "I don't need you to open the door for me." And I was like, okay, not a problem. We can end this date here. And it wasn't that I was offended by it, but I was like, I just know that's how I am. For me, it wasn't to signal that she couldn't do it. but it was a way of being respectful. And I just knew immediately, I'm like, if that's going to set you off, then we're probably not going to get along well.
Yeah.
So how do we find a way to kind of balance this? And I think what it points to is we also have to be open to what is it that's going to respect and serve that other person. So again, I know that's how I was raised, and you be respectful to people. And some people now, some of those things may not land the same way. And so what I also have to tune into is, okay, I know what my intention was. They may not know it. And how do I meet them in what they need that still honors me as well? Because it's not about throwing ourselves out in service of others, but how do we find that common ground? And ultimately, at the bottom end of the day, it's how do we all just respect the humanity in each other? That's what I come back to.
Yeah, because in that example, obviously, if she's already there at this level, at this heightened level of I'm pissed off at the world kind of a thing, because because for that one little act, you don't really have a relationship yet for you to be able to say, well, this is me kind of showing respect to you. If it's something that makes you uncomfortable, then let's, I don't necessarily have to open the door, but this is how it makes me feel and all that. Of course, you're on the first date, so you're not going to have that conversation.
Well, and the Christopher now, if that had happened, I might have been able to say, you know what, I'm sorry. I just did this because it's how I was raised. And if there's something you would like, I have the language now to be able to say that. Back then I was just like, what is the problem? And I couldn't articulate it, and maybe she couldn't either, so I also don't fault her.
Yeah.
I don't know what her lived experience was. Maybe she had multiple examples where other men were, belittling her. And so I might have just happened to be that catalyst at that moment that she took it out on. But, again, I haven't lost sleep over it. My life is not incomplete because of it, but it's a reminder for me of I'm continually checking in and saying, all right, how am I showing up? And more importantly, what's the impact I'm creating? And is it in alignment with the impact I want to create?
Yeah. How do you, what advice do you give guys? Because I know you work with guys all over the place in terms of like identifying, missing elements along this discussion. Like, how do you, like, are there behaviors or the thought process, that?
Yeah. I think it starts with just being curious for yourself, and also being aware of, again, I come back to the word impact. So where are you having the impact you want to create, and where is it not? We always have impact, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And so if you're not getting the results that you're wanting in relationships, in life, look at what are the things you're doing. Get curious about how are people experiencing you, because sometimes we have this image of, oh, I know how I'm showing up and how people see me, and that's not always the case. So you also have to be willing to get honest feedback from people. And if it's feedback that isn't serving what you want to do, you have to be willing to change and take ownership for it as well. Because one of the things that we find lately is people get offended if someone goes, well, I don't appreciate that you did that. And it's like, okay, great. You have every right to be offended. And now I get to decide, how do I want to respond? And a lot of people just get defensive and go, see, it's all them. Well, it takes two to tango. So how do you want to be? And what's, again, the result that you want to achieve? And how do you need to shift your behavior? So I think that's where I'd probably start. It's the curiosity and the awareness, and then be willing to work on yourself. We always have to. Anyone who says, no, I've got it all figured out, that's not somebody I want to talk to.
Yeah. Yeah, those are not people you want to get stuck at at a party, right?
Yep. I will be like, oh, I got to go get my hair done. I'll be back, right?
Right. You have your significant other or anyone else rescue you. Say, after 2 minutes, can you please, watch my face and get me out?
Gotta go, oh yeah, just a second, and you just walk away because they didn't see the fake person that you waved to that was getting your attention. So there's lots of ways you can do it.
There you go. So you're talking mainly like that, because I think a lot of men are so kind of clueless, that they don't, I don't know. I think there are there's a group of men that are more thoughtful in terms of, and I mean thoughtful in terms of identifying some of this stuff that they may have things to work on. But I think there's so many men that are just like, they just sit and exist, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, for those, until they start to get curious or they want to make a change, it's likely not going to happen. It's that saying, you can lead a horse to water, right? But I think that, you have to just tune in and really notice, are you getting the results that you want? And if you're not, okay, then what needs to change? Because in all those relationships that weren't working, there's only one common thread, and that's you. So if all these things if there's a trend, it can't be that there's 25 other people that have the problem. Like, I'm guessing you might want to like point those fingers back this way a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, our society now it's everybody else is always the
absolutely.
problem. Like the social media and just general media and everything else is just like we are so self-centered now, but in a bad way. Like we've dug in.
Here's a news flash. Nobody cares about you as much as you think they do. Like, honestly, every conversation you have, they've forgotten about you minutes afterwards, even though you think that they're still thinking about you. It's a sad truth, but the universe does not revolve around you, although many people think that it does.
Yeah. I'm in one of my business. I have a bunch of different businesses, but one of them is in the detailing space, like automotive detailers. And these guys, there's so many of them that are constantly posting stuff like, that hater this and discouragement this and all that. And I'm like, no one cares about you enough to put the energy that you think that they're putting in. Like if you have a real detractor that calls you up every day and tells you how much you suck, that's one thing. But I think that and it's weird in this industry in particular. I don't know if there are other service industries that do it, but it's, it's like work until your haters are your employees and just stupid stuff.
Honestly, like I don't have enough energy to do all that. I was probably in my 40s when I really owned the lesson that not everybody's going to like me, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because here's a news flash. I don't like everybody, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So that really freed me from worrying about trying to please everybody all the time. And it gave me permission just to be myself. And the great thing about that is the people that like that, they want to hang around more. And the people that don't, they self-select out. Great. Yeah. That makes my life easier.
Yeah, it's a good filter. I always say, you have a finite amount of emotional energy. Why are you giving it away? If this thing is true, and I'll even put on the post on which I'm dumping my own emotional energy into it too, but I'll put on someone's post, if everything you just said is true, even by the act of taking the time to post this on social media, you are giving your emotional energy away towards something that's a complete waste of that.
Yeah. There's two things I want to say. That one, there's a TED Talk by a man named Drew Dudley, and I can't remember the name of it, but I'll think of it and I'll send it to you. But he talks about this idea of like letting somebody rent emotional space in your head. And it's the idea that you're holding on to things that they've probably already forgotten. And so how much energy and time are you putting into it? But the other thing that I use is I use what I call my rule of tens. And so if something's bothering me, I go, okay, is this going to bother me in 10 minutes? If it does, okay, is it going to bother me in 10 hours? How about 10 days? It's rare that I get to 10 days, but if it does, how about 10 weeks? I've never had to go to 10 months or 10 years. And so that helps me think about how much time and energy do I want to put into this right now? And if it's 10 minutes or 10 hours that's going to be bothering me, or 10 hours, all right, I probably need to put some attention. But if it's not going to bother me in 10 days, I'm not going to put a lot of energy in it right now. And like, what's the point? And so that was a great level set for me. And it offends some people because there are some people that really want to get pissed off about things. And I'm like, great, you do you, boo-boo, but I'm going to let that go.
Yeah. Yeah, because it doesn't, I mean, again, if it's that person, how many other people are in your life that you have now given away all of your emotional energy to, and then you don't actually have anything left for yourself or for the people in your life that you care about. I love that 10-10-10 thing, because and what's weird for me is that I probably never get to 10 minutes even. Like I'm not like, there's
not a lot that really does.
Yeah. I don't really care about other people's negative opinions of mine or even positive ones. Like, I mean, I love the accolades or whatever, that kind of stuff from the people. There are a very small list of people that I actually care on whether or not they like me or don't like me. Right. But but I don't I don't care that you're not affecting my life. That being said, I talked a couple of days ago about forgiveness and being able, even if you don't do it physically with the other person and the other person never knows, the forgiveness part of that aspect is for you.
Absolutely.
Like you can easily forgive
yourself.
Yeah. Forgiveness is never for the other person.
Yeah. Stop letting them live rent free in your head. Why? It doesn't make any sense.
Right. And I mean, I don't know whether it's social media. That seems to be something, and maybe, I don't know if you agree with this. It seems to be something since the social media era. Maybe this happened more before, but I didn't see it. And I'm a couple of years younger than you. I'm 50. So
I think I think it probably existed, but it got amplified when we had social media, because now you have these platforms where you can have thousands of potential interactions in moments. And like they've done studies, we get these dopamine hits when we get the likes on our posts and things like that. And so we start to crave it more. Like it becomes addictive, literally. And so I think we see it more because information is much more available to us. I was joking with my daughter the other day. She's like, "Oh, hey, Dad, what is this thing?" And I'm like, "You know what? I don't know." She just pulls out her phone and looks it up.
Yeah.
Well, when I was her age, I would have had to go to the library and get on an encyclopedia because we didn't have the set of encyclopedias at home, or I'd have to do a lot of research. And now, like, information is instantaneously available, which is, again, a blessing and a curse sometimes, because you also don't know how reliable is that source. And so
that's the problem.
the problem is just because it's on the interwebs doesn't mean that it's legit and it's real, right? But not many people, they go, "Oh, I saw it on the internet, so it must be."
I saw some statistic that said that under 25, I think they're getting 50+% of their actual information from TikTok.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm on TikTok for business, and I'll search and look at different things, and there's some decent content out there, but like it's also completely fabricated like everything else is, it's like literally this is but where do we get it? I talked to a lady yesterday, and we're talking about, we've been watching, there's a Hulu documentary 3-part about the Watergate scandal. And we were talking about, first of all, it's crazy on this, and this is how our government still works. So go watch that if you don't. But they were, Walter Cronkite was the example that I gave. Because and even the New York Post, Edward and Bernstein, right? Like they were the ones that broke the story, but they were meticulous about making sure that it was 100% factual before they
posted it, right? That doesn't happen now.
No, it would never happen. Like that's it, and even Walter Cronkite, he was a trusted guy on TV. Yeah. And I'm sure there's propaganda, Vietnam War and some of those, even with, Iraqi freedom and all that, but yeah, it's crazy.
It is. Well, we are, we consume information at such a high rate that we rarely ever stop to think, what is it that I'm consuming? And is it good for me or not?
Yeah. And I think we're losing the ability for logic and common sense decision making. I think, whatever you believe about the whole pandemic thing, but I mean, so many people just lost their mind to where like now they can't even make decisions for themselves, or they're, all that fear and all that. But
well, the thing is too, with the media, depending on what you're listening to, you're going to get more that will support it. Right. And so regardless of what your belief is, it starts to isolate you so that you hear similar messages, and it just makes it more ingrained. And if it's different than what somebody else is thinking, then that just creates more division, which is counter to the thing we started talking about, is we all crave community and connection, but a lot of our society is creating situations that are divisive and want to pull us apart. And that's counter to being effective.
And honestly, it's not, that's the objective, is because if we can continue to divide everybody, then we have our tribe, you have your tribe. Yeah. I don't like any of them. Like I'm a conservative, but like, I don't listen to Fox News because it annoys me. Every time I get on the normal news, I last for 5 seconds before they start manipulating the language on, even if they're reporting something factually, quote unquote, they manipulate the way they talk about it.
Absolutely. Why, my distrust, my skepticism for the media happened when I was in Iraq, and we saw something happen on the ground. Yet when it was reported on the news a day later, it was very different. And I was like, really? And so, again, I remember from my statistics class in college, question the numbers, question the information, because any data can be skewed to tell one story or another, depending on how you present it. And so I've always taken things with a grain of salt. And honestly, I'd rather have a conversation and get to know somebody and understand who they are, rather than read an article about them, because I'm going to learn a lot more here than I am just reading about you, because who knows what that author of that article was wanting to prove and what their agenda might have been. So
yeah,
take it for what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I do some TV stuff, usually automotive, but some reality type stuff, and it's like, really, like the way that so they identify like a villain,
right? Of course,
on some show.
Story has a villain,
and then I'm like, once they identify it early in the season, if you watch Survivor or one of those things, I'm like, I feel so badly for that person because everything they say for the next, 26 days, I think they're doing now, not 39 days or whatever, they're going to vilify this person for the rest of it. They may have an epiphany a week and a half in and be the nicest person, most, congenial that you can be, but you'll never see it.
Well, and it's that bias that we have. So I like to use example. If you're walking out the door in the morning and you stub your toe and go, today's going to suck, it will suck because you will look for things that reaffirm that belief that the day's going to suck. If you stub your toe in the morning and say, ow, that hurt, but it's still going to be a good day, the exact same things could happen to you and you'd have a good day. But because you're looking for things that will affirm that bias, it's going to happen. And that's part of what goes on with this stuff. We tell somebody they're the bad guy, and no matter what they do, we filter through lens of, oh, bad guy. Yeah. And so we taint people because of that.
Yeah, I always try to see where the person's coming from, because if they're a total dick, there's probably a reason they got to that place. I mean, some people are just dicks. I mean,
absolutely. There are some people in the world that I call oxygen thieves. Like they are. Yeah, we could do without them. Natural selection should take place.
Yeah, but most of them have a story on how they got there.
Yeah. Yep. And what I'm also guessing is interact with the person that's here. Just because somebody's told me this person is a dick, well, if they haven't been a dick to me, then why am I going to treat them like that?
Yeah.
I'm going to treat you as a human until you prove me wrong and that I shouldn't do that. But we believe, because I saw this article, I heard this story about them, that means who you are. And so again, we're automatically biased against them to see that thing that we're looking for. Just like if somebody says, oh man, that Kevin guy, he's amazing and just really friendly, then I'm probably going to go, cool, he's a really friendly guy.
Yeah. And
so I've already got that bias. We're preconditioned based on what people tell us.
Yeah, it's funny because with our particular brand in that industry, I've always called myself Switzerland. I literally get along with everybody, whether they're the detailer or manufacturer or the influencer or whatever. But I actually have a mental list when I talk to different influencers in our industry, for example. Right. I know that this guy hates this other guy. Right. So when I talk about that guy to this guy, I'll say, well, I know that you hate this, so-and-so. But I like that guy, and he and I are good friends, so we get along, and then we can have that conversation. But it's so weird to be I don't let that influence me whether or not I still like that person.
Like middle school, right? Who likes so-and-so, who doesn't? Oh, I can't be your friend because you're friends with them. Really? Come on.
Yeah.
Just be adults. Yeah.
And we don't know how to be adults, right? It's so difficult.
There's a lot of us that don't. That's true. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with that and still do it. But, I took a business stance on it to where this is good for my business to be friendly with everybody. And as it turns out, I actually do even though people tend to be an obstacle to me, I actually like most people.
Right.
And then if I don't like you, I'm not going to put any emotional energy into it like we talked about. So it's inconsequential.
I mean, our most important resource is time. It's the one thing we can never get more of or get back. So where are you investing your time? And if that person is, like I said, that I like to call them energy vampires as well. In an interaction with them, do you walk away feeling more energized or less energized? And if it's less energized, then stop spending time around them.
Yeah.
Right? It's not serving you.
Yeah. I actually had to have that. That became something I had to do with my own mom. And it made a
family. It can be hard.
Yeah.
Family, right?
Oh yeah, it was terrible. And people will be like, "What do you mean you don't have a relationship with your mother?" I'm like, "Well, it was.
You needed to.
It wasn't there." She used to send me birthday cards with pictures of me when I was a little kid, and she would write over them, "This is when you used to love me." So I was like, "All right, I'm done, Mom. Thanks. Yep. Thanks for giving birth to me," which that was about the extent of her effort. Yeah. But what are you doing? So with all this in context, what do you do to teach this? You said she's 13, 14?
13 going on 14. Yeah.
So she's in that group to where she's still a kid, but she's starting to this womanhood. What are you teaching her about? In particular, I'd love to know what you're teaching her about interacting with men, and if you've gotten to that,
Wow, that's it.
And how, as a dad, I'm trying to teach the dads, because we're dealing with the same age group, you and I, and other people are listening.
Yeah, I think it starts with the example that you're setting. So regardless of what you say, they are watching what you do. And so I could say, do these 5 things, but if she doesn't see me doing it, that message goes right out the window. So that's the first thing is check in on what's the example you're setting. So that's the beginning for me. I'm also a big believer in like having her challenge and be curious about things as well. So I tried having the talk, probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago. My ex and I, we are great co-parents now. And so we realize our responsibility is raising this young woman responsibly.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had said, okay, it's about time. Now, I know when I was probably 12 or 13 and my mom tried to have the talk with me, like I was just like, oh, Mom, no, I didn't want to have it. So I didn't want her to feel weirded out about it. And I really just approached it and said, listen, things are changing. And I know you're going to have a conversation with your mom, or if you haven't already, you will. There are things that you may be more comfortable talking with her about, but know that I will always be here if you have questions. And I would rather that you ask me than go hear things from your friends or look it up on the internet, which may or may not be true. And if I don't know the answer, then we're going to sit down together and find it. But I would rather do that than you feel like you can have this conversation. Because let's be real, like at 13, they are seeing things and hearing things that we didn't for many years.
Oh, yeah. At 8, right? 8 or 9. Right. Yeah.
So it's about being open and honest with your kids, I think. And we also need to be willing to be in the conversation when it gets uncomfortable. I remember growing up, my mom said to me, if you're ever out, so I grew up in Canada when I was younger. And so the drinking age there was 18, which meant we were in the bars earlier than that.
Yeah.
That's another story. Yeah. I mean, no, we weren't. This is recorded. But she said, if you're going out somewhere, obviously don't drink and drive. But if you ever need a ride somewhere or you get in trouble, you call me. I will come pick you up. There'll be no questions asked, right? We'll talk about it the next day, but like never feel like you can't reach out to me. And so that's something I've communicated as well. And I hope I never have to answer that call. But if she does, I will. I will be there. I will pick her up. I will bring her home safely. And I will not give her any grief about it. And then we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I really instill in her is every morning when I drop her off for school, I say, make good choices. And I reinforce to her that she is a good person and she has a responsibility for making choices. Everything you do or don't do is a choice. And so being aware of that and again, tuning into the impact that you're creating on others. Those are some of the core things, I think, and there's probably more. And I'm sure as soon as we get done with this conversation, I'll think of 5 more things. Yeah. I'm like, I should have told him this.
Right. I really try to do my best to help my girls understand the mentality, especially of a teenage boy. Mm-hmm. And we have this phrase, what are boys? Boys are dumb, kind of a thing. Because not that they're all dumb, but they tend to be. Their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed for like 10 more years, so they got a lot of.
The girls mature faster than boys, so that's also a factor. Absolutely.
And I try to help them understand, because I know when my wife was a teenager, she had a vulnerability and a naivety about her, not because of what she had been educated, just because she assumed boys had the same thought processes and kind of objectives and all that. Right. And that's just. Not that boys are the enemy, but I tried to teach the girls that you need to understand that this boy, when you're wearing a short skirt and thinks it looks cute, not, and we can get into the discussions that he's not thinking that. And that doesn't mean that that's her responsibility for that, but just to understand that this is a factor in the decisions that you're making and how you interact with teenage boys.
Yeah. And I think part of that comes to what are the messages that we're giving young boys as well.
Yeah.
Right. Because we don't necessarily, like, I think about some of my friends growing up and the messaging that they heard from the men in their lives. Like, it wasn't to say, treat a woman with respect. It didn't say that they didn't, but you look at the examples they would see. And so if we're not teaching our boys how to treat women with respect, women and non-binary and all people with respect, then how can we expect them to?
Yeah.
Right. I come back to at an early age when kids are like 2 or 3 years old, they often get the same message. If they have, we all have emotions. We're human beings. And when they're 2 or 3 or 4 years old, we usually we just console them and we comfort them when it happens. But around ages 5, maybe 6, boys and girls start hearing different messages. And little girls start hearing that's okay. And we coddle them and we nurture them. But boys start hearing messages like, don't cry, suck it up, rub some dirt on it. And the worst insult you can have as a little boy is don't be a girl.
Yeah.
And so what the message that they hear is, oh, if I show emotions, I'm not a man, I'm not masculine. And so they start to bottle that stuff up, which then creates a lot of other problems down the road. And so we need to come back to teaching them not just about emotions, but how do we expect young men to behave, not just with women, but with all people, right? If they don't get shown that example, then they're not going to know that's what they're supposed to do. And so that's also part of it.
Yeah, I grew up in the hot rod car world, and what do you see in every old guy's garage, right?
Exactly.
Naked, half naked women on the calendar, and
absolutely,
yeah, all of that. So that's something that they were taught, that was, kind of that objectifying, and I mean, it's something that has to be unlearned, essentially.
And until you have a daughter, we sometimes don't always realize how much of that is out there. Like, I'm sure unconsciously I knew it existed, but I didn't realize how much of our advertising and everything objectifies women. I knew intellectually, but then I started seeing it in places that I wouldn't have ever expected it. And that had me really go, wow. So if I'm getting these subliminal messages all the time, how does that not impact the way that I behave? And so I had to really look at that too. And that's part of what's going on as well, is there's all this subliminal messaging that reinforces us, right? You look at, there was an article I saw the other day. Some reporter, in conjunction with this girl's parents, created I think it was a TikTok account. She was 13 or 14, and within like an hour of them being on there, some of the videos were coming up around like binging and eating disorders and a lot of like stuff that shouldn't have been on for a non-adult account. And they were talking about this messaging that these kids are getting, especially little girls, about the way they're supposed to look and behave. That also contributes to the problem. And again, we're not going to solve that in this conversation, but that's also part of what we're up against too.
Yeah, it's funny. I had to, on the other side, in that same vein, I created a new account for my business for one of my brands. I have like 12, but I created this account, and I actually, because you have to put male or female, or or other or whatever, but I put that I was a male. So I'm first scrolling through, and I show my wife, I'm like, I told you that I'm not going in and purposely seeking out these kinds of accounts. This is, it's literally been 3 minutes.
Yep.
And it's
because they look at the algorithm.
Yeah. It's
middle-aged man.
Yeah.
And like, they're going, oh, he's got these interests. And what they start feeding you is, it's just like, wow.
Yeah. And of course, the problem is that if you stop on it or whatever, because we're visual people, so you can get that attention.
Oh,
yeah.
Then that, right? Did you ever see The Social Dilemma?
Yeah, I did.
That blew my mind of how much, I get a laugh out of sometimes people talk about like, Big Brother's watching all the time and they complain about everything, but they carry these devices with them everywhere. And do you know how much information you're giving away? Oh, yeah. Just by having this, right? Or clicking on that link somewhere. And it's like, that's all right. Bury your head in the sand and pretend that it's not happening.
Well, I mean, we have Alexa in the house, which I know, like So I mean, which is like, I know it's listening to me. They got caught having humans listen to the transcripts, or listen to the recordings, and they kind of had to adjust the privacy settings that way. But my assumption is that because it literally has to listen to you all day long. So if you say Alexa, then it knows you're talking to it, so it's listening to you. I'm okay with that because, like, I don't, whatever. I don't, and as a marketer, because I do social media marketing too, we hated the iOS 14 update because I don't know if you've done any advertising on Facebook, but that doubled the cost of marketing to people.
Okay.
Because it took away all of that targeting. Like I could, for you, I've got a 52-year-old male who, you said on your TED Talk, you're biracial, you have a 14-year-old daughter, what are all those things? I could target down to the very nuance. And now all I get is you're a 52-year-old male that lives in Southern California. So that I have to do way broader marketing. Right. Which at the end of the day, it's a good thing for privacy, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll say on the other end of things, like, I'm glad I don't, like, there's, and I've minimized how much I'm on social media, but it's crazy. I was talking with a friend the other day, and I was like, I mentioned something like, oh, I need to pick that up. And the next time I picked up my phone, there were ads popping up, and I'm like, that is scary. Right. And it's part of the information age we live in. Like, I don't know that I like it, but I don't know how you get around it either. So it's like, how do we balance it?
We're not quite to Minority Report. Have you seen the
No, not yet.
Yeah, where he's literally walking through and they're like, "Hey, John, did you're like, it's
this thing next week. Yeah, we need to go arrest you now." It's like, what?
Yeah, we're not quite there, but well, I've kept you for about an hour. I appreciate you taking the time. I don't know if you want to kind of give a little bit of summary in terms of like what would be what's the next step for your average man? Let's do that.
Yeah. Here's what I'll say. I love that in the conversation you and Ed had, you got to this idea of talking about, saying to your guy friends, I love you.
Yeah.
So here's what I'd offer. If you feel like you're struggling, reach out to a buddy and let them know. Because one of the things that I learned is when I was interviewing men, I would say, what gets in the way of you being more vulnerable? And it's usually around judgment or being seen as less than, or the core things. And then I would say, so if a good buddy of yours shared something he was struggling with, what would you say? And like almost every man said, oh man, I'd have so much respect for him, or I'd feel proud that he reached out to me, or I'd feel grateful that he asked for my help. And then I'd wait for the light bulb to come on and they'd go, oh. So there's this idea that we have as men that vulnerability in others is usually a strength, but in us it's a weakness. So yeah, I share that because there's a guy in your life, I guarantee, that's struggling with something. So the next time you talk to him, ask him how you're doing. When he goes, oh, I'm good, say, how are you really doing?
Yeah.
And if you still get that pat answer, okay. But then maybe you be willing to go first and be a little bit vulnerable. They may or may not respond, but that's how it starts. Yeah. Take that conversation a little bit deeper than who won the basketball game last night, or, what's going on in the races lately. Find something a little deeper and connect. That's where I'd point guys to start, because we're hungry for these conversations. We just don't feel psychologically safe.
Yeah. I have at risk of talking too much about myself, I actually have a perfect example that happened this morning.
Yeah. Let's hear it.
So my wife and I and a group of 7 other couples and people are going to we have a plan to go to the Arctic Circle for 28 days.
Okay.
So yesterday we're having this planning discussion. We've got a group text going and all that. And the guy had posted, so I have like in my head what this is going to cost. Mm-hmm. We're very fortunate that my buddy has sponsorship. So he actually has 2 completely outfitted vehicles that are like, oh, wow. So we basically get to drive like $130,000 vehicle for free. Just pay for pay for gas and food and all that stuff. But this other guy announced that the cost of the ferry, we have to take a ferry from Seattle basically up to Juneau, is $2,250. Yeah. So I thought it was going to be like $700 or $800. And so I start kind of doing the math and all that stuff. And then I'm like, I don't know if we can afford to do this trip. There's always a way to find the money and all that stuff. I'm an entrepreneur, so I can do that. But I had to reach out to my friend this morning, who's probably one of my best friends in the world. And we routinely say, hey, I love you, I appreciate you, and all this. So we have kind of this basic basis of our relationship. But I had to reach out to him, and the first thing that I said in the text was, I'm embarrassed to even have to ask you this. Which I am, because it's a little deeper. I don't need to give the whole backstory, but essentially he has sponsors. So he has sponsors that have put equipment on both vehicles. Mm-hmm. So he and his wife are driving one. Yeah. Michelle and I are driving the other one. And I wasn't sure what I know the vehicle we're driving is going to be in SEMA. It's got a certain, it's fully outfitted and done, and he's finishing up the other vehicle. So I had to ask him, what are your contractual and sponsorship obligations, and what would it look like for you if we weren't able to go? Yeah. Because I don't want to put him in a situation where if we don't go, he's totally screwed. But I also don't want to make a strained financial decision based on feeling obligated, right, to him.
So how did he respond when you said, I'm almost embarrassed to ask?
He said, you don't need to be, the first thing he said was, you never need to be embarrassed with me. Right. Like that's and he's like, I would never want you to be in a position to where you can't go on this trip no matter, and he gave me the truth, because I said, I need to know the truth. He told me everything, and it actually would impact him, but not in a devastating way. Like there's 100% ways if we didn't go, it wouldn't be the end of the world. Right. But then he gave me essentially permission. Like, you can back out. It's totally fine. You don't have to be embarrassed. We'd want to spend this time with you. And I mean, this is a once in a lifetime. We're not going to get this same opportunity again. But that gave me the freedom to make that decision. And he put it, then this is something I love the way that he put this. And I'll use this throughout my life, which is, if the decision is one that creates instant and long-lasting relief to you as a result of the decision, then that's the right way to go. If it's a decision that instantly causes you regret or will have regret in the future as a result of it, you need to think really, really hard on whether or not that's the right decision. So long story short, we're going to go.
Well, see, that's awesome. Here's what I really want to celebrate in that, though. You were willing to be a little bit vulnerable, and he didn't stomp on you for it, right? And that's the message that I really want to emphasize for people. We often think, I can't say that thing because it's not going to be well received. And 9 out of 10 times, probably more than that, the other person, they're human. They've made mistakes, and they're probably going to go, no problem, let's be in conversation. Yeah. So like, that just makes the point. Be willing to go first and open up, get a little deeper than the token shallow conversation we normally have, and see what it does for that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause he's one that he's famous in his own right, but he has some, very famous parents, and, but he is self-made. He doesn't take any money from the family. So I knew going in that he and I can have that conversation, knowing that he understands where we are, and to be vulnerable. And the title of the podcast with Ed was "I Love You, Man," and other important things you're supposed to say, right? Like that's that's something that I started doing a few years ago with some of my guy friends, and it's usually uncomfortable for them, but eventually it sort of comes back around. And it's just something simple, like, because my friends, if I love them, it's important that they know that, and it's okay for me to say it.
Well, and one of the things, and we won't open up this can of worms, but often we associate love with intimacy and a romantic intimacy, and that's not what it is. Like, the heart has an infinite capacity to love. I can say I love you to lots of people, and it doesn't mean that I have less for other people.
Right.
But we sometimes go, if somebody says I love you, that it becomes weird. No, it's just saying I appreciate you, I care about you. So say it more. Like, it feels good to hear it from people. Yeah. So the more we do it, the more it normalizes it.
I have one friend that's a little bit older than us, and he's a long-term hot rod guy. And I always say, I joke with, like, we made it a thing that I say, I love you, man, but not in a weird way.
Well, and you know what? But that, and again, cool. And I'm glad you can say that. And it still makes me a little bit sad that you have to add that disclaimer at the end, right?
But it became a thing. Like at first it made him uncomfortable, but the more that we say it, like, then it becomes, then it puts more emphasis on the first part of the statement. Yeah. Right. Because then
the invitation is try just saying I love you. Yeah. Right. See how that lands. So
his wife makes fun of us, and she bought us for Christmas one year one of those best friend bracelets where it has the 2 hearts. So like for us, it's kind of this it's kind of this running joke, right? Yeah. But I think that's a good way to do it, because we have so many relationships with men where it's humor, self-deprecating humor. Other deprecating humor. And if there's a way for you to bridge those 2 things by using that part of your relationship, I think that's okay to do.
Yeah. That creates much stronger connections than the ball busting and all that other stuff. Like, we can say there's a place for it, and knowing that somebody really cares about you, like, that has just infinite power for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one buddy of mine, he's like, and I know it's true, he's like, I love you enough that I would hide the body.
Well, there you go. Right? I'm my best friend. If my phone rings at 3 a.m, we got to hide a body, I'll probably try and talk you out of it, but I'll do it. Right?
Yeah,
like,
we'll get it done.
But that's how much trust I have and love for you. So
yeah, for sure. Hey, how do we find you? How do we get in touch? So you've got your own podcast, so we want to know about that and everything else you get.
Yeah. So if you want to find out more about the book, the website is wholemanjourney.com. The word whole, not hole like hole in the ground. The podcast is at vulnerable-man.com. It's the Vulnerable Man Podcast. And if you find me on LinkedIn, it's the one that has Vulnerability Vanguard in my title as well. So you'll know that's the right Christopher Veal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And this has been great, Phil. I always feel like that I could talk on these forever. But I'm not Joe Rogan, so I can't do 3.5 hours of 3.5 hours of podcast.
I wouldn't mind Joe Rogan's money though.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think those guys are coming knocking on my door any day soon. But
we need it. Well, Kevin, thank you for having me on, and I appreciate what you're doing with this podcast and helping men. And I'm excited for what the future holds for you as well.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much, man.
All right.
All right.
If you're looking to really maximize your life and become the man you were made to be, head over to maxedoutman.com and get your journey started today.